You ask 10 different people and they'll probably give you 10 different responses. Some will say it's about preventing cramping. Some will say it's about just maintaining overall blood volume and that might help performance. Some people will say it's actually to try and increase thirst, so I actually drink more, so it encourages me to be better hydrated during exercise. Some people might say it's to prevent hyponatremia. So it's different things to different people.
Team, welcome to another week of the Mops and Mo's podcast, and I hope you drank your electrolytes. And
I hope you didn't.
You didn't, and I hope you didn't, and had some caffeine. You have something?
I also did not do that.
Did not do caffeine. Don't drink anything, guys. What are you? Caffeine.
I am hitting the 1 week mark right now of being zero caffeine.
Is that for forever?
No, I do this like once a year.
I forgot
or so.
about this. Yeah, you do. You weirdo.
Yeah. For one, I don't like being chemically dependent on anything, and caffeine is like a habit-forming drug, right?
Dopamine a chemical?
But like external dependency is different than like internal. Like I am chemically dependent on water. I'm not trying to eliminate that. But like,
yeah.
as much as we treat it as something different, like
it's a drug.
Coffee is a drug,
it's
and
so
your coffee
good,
machine is drug paraphernalia. It's just one that's like really accepted.
I bought a pretty sick bit of drug paraphernalia then the other week. I've got some pretty nice looking drug paraphernalia sitting on my kitchen counter. Makes a phenomenal crack cocaine espresso.
What's This Is Your Brain on Drugs? What's the author of that? No.
Is that Michael Pollan?
Michael Pollan. I think This Is Your Mind on Drugs, maybe, is Michael Pollan.
Does he talk about caffeine?
Caffeine is one of them.
Did you see
introduced the concept to me, pretty wild for me. First, I should say I got to go back and correct it. I'll get the correct title. This Is Your Brain on Drugs is like a massively large
This Is Your Mind
scale.
on Plants.
It was an anti-drug campaign in 1987. Yeah. Oh, This Is Your Mind on Plants. Is that what it is?
No, that's the Botany of Desire. I know
you're right.
About.
It is. This Is Your Mind on Plants. That's the right one.
Yeah.
That's the one where he talks about caffeine among other drugs. But he makes a pretty coherent argument that the reason caffeine is like widely accepted and legal, and the reason that weed is widely not accepted and illegal, although that's changing a little bit recently, is that caffeine makes you a better factory worker and weed makes you a worse factory worker. So like the powers that be that are motivated by maximizing GDP want people taking caffeine and producing more GDP, not taking weed and producing less GDP.
Well, there's also, 1 second. There's a scientist, Kesha, and she says your love is my drug. So where do you stand on love during your caffeine fast?
I'm okay with being dependent on love, water, carbs, protein, fat, and some micronutrients.
You listed off a lot of things. Some would say all you need is love.
I fear that without the other things, love might not sustain you.
Love is all you need.
Shelter, pretty cool with shelter.
Give me shelter. Who said that?
Damn it.
It's the Rolling Stones.
It's getting really annoying.
Listen, I could do this all day. But here's the kicker. If I were to do this all day, what would I need? Electrolytes.
Only if you did it for like more than 4 hours or so. But we'll get to that.
Fun fact, all day is more than 4 hours. Team, this week we're talking about electrolytes, and we're talking about electrolytes with...
We are talking to Dr. Alan McCubbin. I will get to his bio in a moment and just say that this episode is motivated for a very specific reason. I, like many others, have seen the rise of not just a popularity for electrolyte supplements, but a push for like daily electrolytes regardless of physical activity, like convincing people they need to like get salty or whatever.
Get salty.
I don't want to get like too into the marketing for specific brand name products, but I am, like most people, aware that most Americans consume way too much salt already. It is a risk factor for heart disease. If you have high blood pressure, you should probably be reducing it. The DASH diet is all about reducing sodium consumption, and it is an evidence-based way to lower your blood pressure. And I think we just overhyped electrolytes to a kind of extreme degree. I posted about it. Some people were very upset with me. They were like, this is ridiculous. Like dietitians would never say this, whatever. So I went and talked to a bunch of dietitians, and ended up scheduling this episode with kind of like one of the leading experts on the topic.
The guy.
So that's the genesis of this episode, which brings us to Dr. Alan McCubbin. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food within the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing, and Health Sciences at Monash University. He is an accredited practicing dietitian and accredited sports dietitian, and in 2021 was awarded Fellowship of Sports Dietitians Australia for his combined research and education contributions to the profession. Alan completed his PhD at Monash, focusing on dietary sodium intake practices of endurance athletes and the likely implications for health and performance during exercise. Since then, he has continued work in defining the sodium requirements of endurance and ultra-endurance athletes before, during, and after exercise. He has also contributed to other projects within the sports dietetics and extreme physiology team at the university, including the impacts of nutrition and exercise on the gastrointestinal tract of athletes. Alan is the course coordinator for Sports Dietitian Australia's Sports Nutrition course, which is the qualification required for dietitians in Australia and New Zealand to become accredited in sports nutrition practice. He also works as a practitioner, primarily for endurance and ultra-endurance athletes. He has regularly contributed to several print and online media productions for cyclists, trail runners, and triathletes in the past decade, and is the founder and co-host of a podcast dedicated to answering nutrition questions that runners, cyclists, and triathletes commonly ask. That podcast is called Fueling Endurance, if you want to check it out. I will also say that he has appeared on a number of other podcasts, so if this topic is interesting to you and you want to dive deeper, especially if you want to dive deeper in the specifics for endurance runners and cyclists, go check out his other work. And Alan formerly competed at a national and international level in sailing and recreationally in endurance mountain biking.
He also has a sweet, sweet Australian accent.
Everything sounds smarter with an accent.
Yeah, which is funny if you think about it. I think that comes from like the cinema world. Like Australians always sound smart or chill.
It's kind of Nazareth syndrome if you think about it.
Yeah, Romans apparently have British accents. Most villains have British accents. But no, I think to your point, this is a very timely conversation. It's also a very important conversation because, like you, I too see a lot of unnamed powder-filled packets.
Some of these are on military installations making
most
false
amounts.
claims.
Yes. And I think the summary, and we hit this in the after party, in the closing bit after we talked to Alan, the summary point is that you basically don't need them.
Yeah.
Unless
we will, in the course of this episode, identify the criteria you can use to identify when you do need them.
Stay tuned.
You probably don't meet that criteria.
You are probably not that person.
Almost ever.
Ever. Unless you move for a long time. In which case, perhaps you could be that person. Or you're like me and you just like the flavor of these things. Because honestly, I'll overdose on electrolytes happily because they taste pretty darn good. But no, I think some surprising information here for folks that think that this is literally necessary to their day-to-day existence.
The list of supplements that are like safe, effective, and worth your money is surprisingly short. I will say electrolytes probably meet that for very specific people, but it's fewer people than you might be led to believe by the marketing coming from brands trying to convince everyone that they need to use their product every day.
As is often the case, team. So thanks for hanging out with us this week. Stick around as we cut through the bullshit of electrolytes.
Team, we all sleep. We all conduct a bunch of activities. We all train and we all recover from stress. Teamworks pulls it all together in real-time readiness dashboards because when data is connected, readiness follows. Visit teamworkstactical.com today to learn more.
I have a potentially stupid question to open us up here. Your work seems to focus specifically on sodium.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to use the word sodium and electrolytes interchangeably for this conversation, or is that oversimplifying it and like ignoring potassium and?
Yeah, no, I mean, you could start with that and then we can talk about the differences and where there's overlap and where there isn't overlap, maybe.
Okay. That seems fair. Because most of my, maybe this will help set up the conversation. Where I came to this conversation from in the first place, not so long ago, everybody was trying to minimize salt in their diet because people overconsume salt generally in Western countries. High blood pressure is a common problem. We're trying to minimize that, whatever. And all of a sudden, a few years ago, it's become a huge deal for like everybody to take electrolyte supplements daily. And
Yes.
it feels to me like that is not only like unhelpful from a performance standpoint, but possibly acutely harmful. And that's where I started looking at like who's researching in this space and who are we supposed to talk to? Because like is that as dumb as it seems? That's my question.
Yes.
Episode complete. Cool.
Done. Idiots.
Can you break that down for us? Is it just a phenomenon of like, because electrolyte supplementation is certainly valuable in very specific contexts, and I think that's where a lot of your research is. Like, how does this whole phenomenon look from your perspective?
It's an interesting one. I think a lot of it has been commercially driven, for sure. There seems to have been this message. I don't know whether you guys get this impression as well, but certainly from my perspective, the impression is that it's been since COVID. Kind of, if you draw a line around COVID, after that, there's been this real boom in daily electrolyte supplementation. And so, where does that come from, I guess, is the question. I think for me, like if we think back, and I'm probably a bit older than you guys, if we think back to the 2000s, a lot of the messaging was everyone's not hydrated because we don't drink enough water. We need to drink our 8 glasses a day of water, whatever it might be. Then there's contention around, is that enough? Is that too much? Is that about right? Is there any evidence for that, etc.? And then I think that sort of coincided with a lot of sort of environmental moves against single-use plastic and things. And those two things kind of came together with, and I don't have it next to me, the giant stainless steel water bottle.
Yes.
Well, I'm talking liters, obviously, but the
thought I
1
had
or
one
2
in here.
liter water bottle, or sometimes they're plastic. People walking in and out of the gym with this thing like the size of their head full of water.
Mhm.
So that was kind of, I think, the ground or the basis for where the electrolyte kind of message came from. So if you drink a whole bunch of water and you're not consuming any food or any electrolytes or anything like that, and you drink a whole bunch of water on an empty stomach, you'll absorb it pretty quickly. It'll dilute your blood. Your kidneys will respond as they should, pee out pretty much all of that water. And probably the most well-known study around this was published in 2016. They came up with this thing called the Beverage Hydration Index. So it's basically this index of different beverages, plain water, sports drinks, milk, clinical electrolyte solutions for rehydration.
Before we lose this one, just for the audience, can I just ask a clarification question?
Yeah.
Is milk more hydrating than
I was going to say,
water?
wasn't it that was the milk one, right?
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So the 2 drinks that stood out from that were milk and the clinical rehydration solutions. And we'll talk about why, because there's differences in why both of those were effective. But basically what they did is they gave people that were already well hydrated. So these were not dehydrated people. And that's, I think, a really important point to start with. They made them drink a liter of whichever fluid they were testing. And then they would measure their urine output over 4 hours after they drank it. And so you see these beautiful graphs in the paper, and you see the sort of cumulative urine output, and therefore the fluid that was retained is calculated from the ins minus the outs, typical what we'd call fluid balance. And at the end of the 4 hours, what you see is that apart from the milk and the very high electrolyte rehydration solution, pretty much all of the others, the amount of fluid that was consumed has been peed out by the end of the 4 hours, and sometimes more. And so that's where I think this message comes from, that quote unquote, water doesn't hydrate you. And that's really the message that we're seeing attached to the marketing of all these kind of daily electrolyte supplements that have really proliferated since COVID. Coming back to the milk versus the electrolytes, what's the difference here, or why do those 2 stand out? Well, I think it's for 2 different reasons. So with the electrolytes, you're adding a whole bunch of primarily sodium, and that goes into the blood, and we can maybe talk about that later, but that's going to stop that dilution of the sodium concentration in the blood, or dilute it to a smaller extent because of all the water that you drank with it, so you don't pee as much of that out. So that helps retain it by acting in the blood. The milk has quite a different effect, which is actually slowing down the emptying from the stomach. So it's kind of like when you eat a meal, and obviously milk has got protein, and depending on if it's skim milk or full fat milk's got fat in it and other things as well. And so that is going to empty more slowly from the stomach compared to a sports drink or water or an electrolyte drink or something like that that's got very little calories in it. And so that fluid from the milk is sort of being released slowly from the stomach, and it's going to trickle into the blood more slowly as it gets absorbed from the gut. And so it's the effect of diluting, you're not shoving all of that fluid into the blood in a very short period of time and diluting what's in there. You're sort of trickling it in over a longer period of time, and it's having a less dilutionary effect. And so both of those have effects on fluid retention. But if we think about that beverage hydration index, it's simply fluid intake and urine output. What it doesn't measure is where is that fluid in between those 2 points? Is it in the body, in the blood, or is it still in the gut somewhere? And so that's probably going to be the difference between the milk and the electrolyte drink is, yes, technically both of them are in the body, but one of them is still making its way through the gut. It actually hasn't made its way into the blood yet to hydrate you. The other one is already in the blood.
So I can't swap out my like oral rehydration stuff with like a gallon of milk in my Camelback or something.
Well, probably not. I guess there's a lot of practical issues along with that.
So gross.
Both from a food safety point of view, but also a gastrointestinal tolerance point of view. Plus, you probably just don't need that much protein, that much carbohydrate, that much calcium, et cetera, in one hit. So yeah, there's obviously a practical aspect to that as well. But yeah, so you've got these two different beverages that I guess act on quote unquote fluid retention, but in quite different ways. And then you've got the messaging that comes from that is water doesn't hydrate you because you drink it and look, you just pee it all out again. So I think that as an outsider, I'm obviously not involved in the electrolyte supplement industry, but I think that's kind of where a lot of the marketing messages come from is, see, there's this study and you drink all this water and then you just pee it out again. But if you take our high salt solution, you'll retain more of that water. So I think that's the basis of where it comes from. But again, the study was done in people who were already hydrated. They drank a liter of water. They're peeing out the liter of water that they probably didn't need in the first place. It's a mechanistic study. It's not a practical real world study, which is fine, but it has to be interpreted in that context as well.
I mean, maybe this is an unanswerable question, but like, how do you, I want to say, how do you get away with that? Like, that seems like such an obvious reason as to why milk would have quote unquote scored better than water. But like, how are you then allowed to turn that around and say it's not as hydrating as water, given that all these other confounding variables exist? Is that just the nature of marketing off the back end of science?
I would say so. And it's hard to say whether it's disingenuous or just they don't understand the science.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It makes a really good, simple graphic where you write a bunch of beverages and like have bar graph and forget about how they got to that bar graph. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wild.
The other thing to add into the mix, if you think about the milk effect that I just mentioned, there is research looking at what happens when you start adding real food into the mix as well, alongside fluids. Because most people, when they finish exercise, yes, they're going to have the fluid, but they're probably going to eat something as well. Within the first couple of hours. And that's going to have a similar effect to the milk. It's going to slow down the emptying of the stomach. And what you see in that research is that once you start introducing solid food into the mix, the type of beverage makes no difference to that fluid retention at all. So you can have the saltiest electrolyte drink or you can have plain water, but because that stomach emptying has been slowed down, you're not going to lose that fluid in the same way. So what I would say from that is that these high electrolyte beverages, yes, they help you retain fluid if you're drinking large amounts of fluid on an empty stomach when you're well or close to well hydrated. But if you're severely dehydrated, it probably still has an effect because there is a whole body of research around that. But if you start to introduce solid food into the mix, which is normally eliminated in research to try and keep it clean and isolate mechanisms, but that's not the real world. So as soon as you start adding food to that, the type of drink probably doesn't matter that much.
Weird side question. I hadn't thought of this until just now, but it was something I stumbled upon years ago. Are you familiar with a series of articles titled The Hyponatremia of Exercise by Tim Noakes that he wrote for CrossFit?
Not those ones specifically, but I'm very familiar with Tim's work in this area. And you may not see it in the background. His book Waterlogged is on that shelf there somewhere. And actually, it was a keynote presentation that Tim did at a conference just after that book was published that sort of got me interested in this whole, I was already sort of interested in this sodium area, but kind of inspired the work that I ended up doing for my PhD. So, yeah.
Would you concur with the general premise that there's like an over focus on maximal hydration or potentially overhydration in exercise settings?
As in, we shouldn't drink as much as people think they need to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's his general argument as far as, he gets way in the weeds. It's a 12-part series, but... Yeah,
look, I think there's, and that's obviously context dependent. It depends if you're going to the gym, if you're running an ultra marathon, if you're racing a marathon.
We'll get to those contexts.
Hot conditions and all that kind of thing. So obviously there's some context and nuance around that. But yes, you don't need to replace every drop of fluid you lose, that's for sure. And I think that message is pretty universally accepted now, whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, that was contentious. It's not anymore.
So you talked about 20 or 30 years ago and things being less contentious now. Before we dive into some of the specific situations, I was in the Army for a long time. I'm still in the reserve. I see this stuff about hydration and safety and heat injury prevention and all this stuff. And sometimes the way it's presented makes it seem like the science around sweat testing, the science around like urine specific gravity, urine color, like how much water to intake, whether to have supplement, whatever, like it is presented as very settled science. And when I started reading some of your work, I got a lot less confident, frankly, because it seemed like we were not quite as close to conclusive answers on some of these things as I had the impression that we were. Is that what is the state of the research in this field?
Yeah, I think the words bit like settled in bits and not in others is probably a fair description. There's some areas that I think we got pretty good consensus on and reasonable data, others much less so. And then others where I think there is consensus, but I'm not convinced that it's based on really great evidence. So there's lots of bits that you mentioned there. Some of that is around sort of testing, are you hydrated, which is where the urine specific gravity and things comes into the picture. There's a really great paper, 2009, Lawrence Armstrong, who's now retired, phenomenal researcher in this area. I can't remember the exact title of the paper, but it's along the lines of assessing hydration status, the elusive gold standard. And he talks about there's lots of different ways that you can try to get some insight into someone's level of hydration at any given point in time, but none of them are perfect. You can only get sort of insights into aspects of this at any given time, and you probably need different things to put it together. Urine is an interesting one because it gets relied on a lot because it's easy to collect. It's relatively non-invasive compared to taking blood samples and things like that. Easy to analyze, whether it's specific gravity. That's a very easy test to do as long as you've got the equipment. It's not expensive. The problem with urine, though, is that it doesn't. It's not a measure of hydration. It's a measure of what the kidneys are doing to try and maintain hydration. Now, often those two are well correlated, particularly when you're well rested. But if you've just finished exercise, for example, or during exercise, these are not well correlated at all. Particularly once you're sweating a lot, your kidneys tend to produce a lot less and more concentrated urine, and that gives you a false impression that you're potentially more dehydrated than you might be in that situation. So it's useful, but there's a lot of nuance around how you interpret urine data, I think, that gets lost in a lot of the messaging. And then obviously you've got your blood tests and things like that. If we look at other areas like, probably the big one is the 2% loss of body weight through fluid loss. And that in itself has been a nuance. A long time ago, people just sort of said 2% body weight loss and forgot but that loss has to be the fluid component as opposed to loss of weight through any other means. Suggests dehydration and performance is impaired. Now, even that, while there's pretty good consensus on that, I'd say in some areas there isn't. But if you look at the studies which come to that conclusion, generally they're what I would call dichotomous studies. So you give people either heaps of fluid, so they lose basically no body weight, or you don't give them any fluid and they just happen because of the length of the study, the conditions, etc. They lost about 2 to 2.5% of their body weight. So when you don't let them drink anything, they don't perform as well compared to when you force them to drink 100% of their fluid losses, which is pretty rare in the real world anyway. So 2 issues there. One is it's dichotomous, so there's no sort of dose response. You're saying that 2% is worse than 0%, but what about 1% or 1.5% or 3%? So there's no sort of comparison there. The second issue, obviously, with hydration research is it's very hard to placebo control hydration research. How do you know if you've drunk a bucket load of fluid or you haven't, or if you're not allowed to drink in those conditions. And so it's very likely that there's a placebo effect in there. And so there has been some work recently. I'll give a shout out to Lewis James at Loughborough University in the UK. He's done a lot of this work. There's a lab in the US, Arkansas, I think, as well, that have done some of this work where they've actually used nasogastric feeding tubes that you use in hospitals to actually infuse the water so you can blind the participants so they don't know how much fluid they're actually getting. And so they've done some of that work, which suggests that once you start getting to sort of 2.5-3% body mass loss versus not much body mass loss, then yes, there is an effect on performance and you can blind that and people don't know how much fluid they're getting. Once the differences become smaller, like 0% versus 1.5%, is much less clear, and blinding probably is important. So, and the new or the latest, I guess, frontier in this research is starting to unpack different types of exercise. So like cycling versus running. So the majority of these studies are done in the lab on a stationary bike because it's very easy. You can measure power output and it's very easy or relatively easy to measure performance that way. But of course, cycling is what we call weight supported. So you don't have to physically carry that weight, whereas running or any other exercise that involves carrying your own body weight, when you've got different body weights because of hydration, there's an energy cost to carrying that extra fluid as well. And so some of Lewis's work and his team at Loughborough are starting to look specifically at running now. And I think some of their early findings are suggesting that maybe actually performance isn't impaired until much greater body mass losses in running compared to cycling. So that's a new area, and I think one we'll see sort of publications emerge in the next few years.
This is a quick one because I think I saw it in your work. Is it accurate to say that for like competitive/elite marathon runners, like consuming fluids during the race is probably unnecessary?
It depends on
electrolyte versus fluid, so it certainly changes.
Yeah. So electrolytes probably yes. Fluids, it depends on the weather conditions largely. But a sport like marathon is difficult because there are only a few opportunities to actually access fluid along the course. And particularly for the elite guys, and they're working that hard, they're breathing that heavily, there's only so much fluid that you can actually put in your mouth, get it in your mouth without spilling it everywhere, and then swallow it without choking when you're working that hard. So I think for an event like a marathon, a lot of the limitations to hydration are actually practical rather than physiological.
Makes sense.
So I guess the question everybody wants to know, right, with all of the new supplements coming out and all the powders and things like that, when is it actually appropriate to start dumping that stuff into your massive aluminum water bottle?
Yeah, great question. And I think the first part to this, I'd say, and it doesn't matter whether it's sodium, whether it's other electrolytes, whether it's any kind of supplement, the first thing you always need to bear in mind is what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? What is the end goal of whatever intervention it is? And when we think about sodium, different people have had different ideas of what that end goal is supposed to be. You ask 10 different people and they'll probably give you 10 different responses. Some will say it's about preventing cramping. Some will say it's about just maintaining overall blood volume and that might help performance. Some people will say it's actually to try and increase thirst, so I actually drink more, so it encourages me to be better hydrated during exercise. Some people might say it's to prevent hyponatremia. So it's different things to different people. And so some of the work I've done recently is a review paper where I sort of went back and systematically looked at all of these sort of different rationales and tried to pull together the evidence for each one and either say, yes, there is evidence for this, or no, really, there isn't. And so to answer your question, it's going to be different whether it's before, during, and after exercise, and it's going to be different depending on what the actual goal is that you're trying to achieve. So I don't know where you want to start. We can sort of go through them one by one.
I think, well, so the example I'll throw at you is one that like we see all the time on the military side, which is, you know, for various reasons, certain brands are more available than others. I'll throw Drip Drop out there because it's everywhere.
I will say briefly, I don't know if Drew's up to speed on this. Drip Drop is a huge problem for Army dietitians because they keep making false claims on Army bases, and
it is everywhere, and it tastes delicious. And you're seeing service members who feel that this is now just like an absolutely essential piece of, you know, quote unquote kit before you go out on a ruck. And I mean, Alex, what do you want to call it? Like maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. They're
often,
rucking.
yeah.
And you want to say you don't necessarily need that, but I leave it to you in that example. Like, what would you recommend?
Yeah. So I think the other thing that has been confused, and to be fair, just to a lack of real evidence on this, is are we trying to replace sodium to prevent a sodium deficiency, like a drop in the total amount of sodium in the body? And that's, I think, how a lot of the products, and not just the recent ones, but over 20, 30 years have kind of framed it, that you lose sodium and electrolytes in sweat. If you don't replace them and you lose too much, you get into a deficit and then something bad is going to happen. The other way of framing it is, rather than the total amount of sodium in the body, it's the concentration of sodium relative to the fluid. So it's the balance between the sodium and the fluid. There hasn't really been much research to try and pick those two things apart and answer the question. And so a lot of people are going out, as you said, I'm going out, it's going to be hot, I'm going to sweat a lot, I'm going to lose a lot of sodium, so I need to make sure I either, quote unquote, load up beforehand to try and offset that deficit, kind of like loading up on carbohydrate before exercise because you're going to burn it during the exercise, or try and replace it during exercise. Now, I published a study a couple of years ago where we got people on a treadmill in the lab running for 5 hours. And yeah, it was a bit of a nightmare to recruit, as you can imagine. We managed to find 9 people in the end that agreed to do this because they had to do it twice.
Did they need to be untrained, or I'm assuming these were trained individuals?
Oh, they were ultra runners.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of them were, I think, Ironman athletes, but the majority were ultra runners. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we got them to replace literally 100% of their sodium losses. So we sweat tested them a couple of weeks earlier to predict how much they were going to lose, or literally zero. And we did this in capsules so we could blind it. So they either had salt capsules or placebo capsules for the 5 hours. And we looked at things like rectal temperature, heart rate, thirst, how much fluid they voluntarily drank, perceived exertion.
Can I ask what the placebo capsule was?
Oh, it was just a little bit of maltodextrin just to give it the same weight.
Yeah, because we're going to, in a second, I want to get into a conversation about like carbs versus electrolytes or carbs with electrolytes. We'll get there when we get there. If it was sugar, it introduces a whole different thing.
Yes. But I mean, the amount in the capsules, you're talking like less than a gram per capsule. So it's not a big deal. But yeah, over those 5 hours, and we looked at all these different things and we found absolutely no difference between them. So the placebo group lost about 5,500 milligrams of sodium over the 5 hours, which equates to roughly 8 to 9% of all the sodium that was in their body at the start. So they lost 8 or 9% of their total body sodium, and we saw no differences whatsoever in any of those measures. The second part is the blood sodium concentration and trying to keep that stable and prevent the hyponatremia that you mentioned before, Alex. And that's where sodium can play a role, but it's generally much longer durations of exercise. You need to be losing probably 5-6 liters of fluid plus, and replacing a fair chunk of that, probably 70% or more, to be in the situation where you're likely to dilute your blood sodium other than over drinking, which we're not encouraging anyway. So as long as you're not over drinking, and in which case sodium's of limited help because you're just putting too much fluid in. But if you're replacing more than 70% but less than 100% of your fluid losses, theoretically you can start to dilute your blood sodium, but you need to be doing that for several hours before it's actually going to have a meaningful effect.
So are you telling me that my delicious hot cider flavored pre-bedtime electrolyte powder is completely unnecessary?
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, unless you're drinking a bucket load of fluid with it and you want to not be up all night peeing, it'll help
It's
for
like
that.
a small mug, as advertised in the commercials.
Yeah,
fine. I'll put it away.
Look, if your blood pressure's normal, it's unlikely to be harmful, but it's probably not likely to have a huge beneficial effect as well. Yeah.
Man. Okay.
If you're on a human performance team, you know how it goes. 9 or 10 platforms, spreadsheets, Facebook groups, Signal chats. Teamworks replaces all of it with one secure, centralized communication system built for distributed military teams. To learn more, visit teamworkstactical.com today. Team, this episode of Mops and Mo's is brought to you by Train Heroic. Train Heroic is a reliable, well-designed platform for programming, tracking, and communicating with athletes. If you've been with us for any length of time, you will know that Train Heroic is the platform that we use to power our own training, long and strong, which you can find at our website, mopsandmos.com. If you're looking for a solid platform to support your own coaching, whether it's your full-time role or a side hustle, Train Heroic is definitely worth checking out. You can use the link in any of our show notes, you can find it in our newsletter, or you can head to our website, mopsandmos.com/training to get your first week for free.
I'll hit the carb one I was talking about, because this one, like, recently I posted about some of this stuff and I got a lot of pushback from people, and that's like what led me to schedule this podcast, is I want like an actual expert to like test some of my ideas with. Because I said that like electrolyte supplementation is probably unnecessary for like the vast majority of the people on vast majority of days, and people got pretty upset with me. And one comment that came up, I'm familiar with the whole, like, I think it's called sodium glucose co-transport. Like glucose helps you absorb electrolytes when you consume them. And I think there's like some awareness of that out there, like consume carbs with your electrolytes together, you'll absorb both better. Cool. Lately, I've been hearing about people trying to achieve that mechanism without any carbohydrates, because they're trying to minimize carbohydrates and maximize electrolytes. Isn't, in all the situations where that would be important, isn't the evidence for carbohydrates way better than the evidence for sodium supplementation, though? Are we like eliminating the one that might actually have a performance benefit so we can like focus on the one that maybe possibly has a small one?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it depends on the context of why you're taking the whole concoction in the first place, if it's for hydration reasons or for fueling reasons. The sodium and glucose transport is an interesting one. What you tend to see is once the carbohydrate concentration tends to get up to your standard sports drinks around sort of 5-6% carbohydrate or above, up to your Mortons and things these days, like 16% carbs. At those levels, the amount of sodium doesn't seem to make a difference for the carb absorption. It's only at really low carb concentrations that the co-transport seems to have a meaningful effect. If you remove all that carbohydrate completely, will that affect the sodium absorption? Maybe a little bit, but probably for the majority of people in the majority of cases, it's probably not going to be enough to have a noticeable difference.
So to make sure I understand that right, the co-transport thing really only matters at low carb concentration combinations of the two.
Yeah. Got it. So your typical oral rehydration solutions that come in little stick packs, because obviously there's not much carbohydrate, so you can reduce it down to like 3 grams of powder instead of 30 grams of powder. Those ones is where that little bit of carb may make a difference, and that co-transport becomes more important. But yeah, otherwise, not really.
People were
Okay.
throwing hate in the Instagram comments because you told them they didn't need their supplements.
I mean, there's a lot of people taking either like daily electrolyte supplements, regardless of what exercise they are doing, or turning to electrolyte supplements when they're running like I run 15 miles a week-ish. That means I'm like maybe once per week on the weekend running anything that's over an hour. I don't think that like electrolyte stuff really matters. And a lot of people who spend a lot less time doing cardio than I do seem to think it's very, very important that they take a bunch of electrolytes when they do that cardio. And that's where I'm like, I just don't, the more I read about it, the less convinced I am that that's an important factor in these situations.
Yeah, it's probably worth explaining, what actually happens when you sweat and in terms of the blood sodium concentration and what that's
Please
actually
do.
doing in the body. Yeah. So basically our sweat gland's obviously in our skin tissue, and the base of the sweat gland is surrounded by what we call the interstitial fluid. So this is the outside of our cells, because the cells form the sweat gland itself, obviously. And it's the fluid that exchanges at the capillaries with our blood. And so when the sweat glands first start to make sweat, it draws that fluid in from around the outside of it, this interstitial fluid. Most people consider that to be more or less the same composition as blood. There's probably some nuance to that, but it's probably close enough for practical purposes. And so the initial sweat that we produce is roughly the same electrolyte composition as our blood. So we can take a blood sample in research and use that as an approximation. Then as the sweat travels up through the sweat gland towards the skin surface, there's a whole bunch of cells that line the sweat glands that start to reabsorb some of the sodium and chloride back into the body. Now, those can be regulated, and we can get into that later if you think it's relevant. But basically what that means is that as the sweat travels up the duct, it's going to recapture some of the sodium and chloride. And so the actual final sweat sodium and chloride concentration of the sweat that ends up leaving the body is lower than what's in the blood. The result of that is you're losing fluid and you're losing sodium in your sweat, yes, but you're losing proportionally more fluid compared to sodium in your sweat. So if you think about then what's left over, it's going to be the opposite to that. So as you dehydrate, if you go out for a run, warm conditions, you start sweating, you don't eat or drink anything, your blood sodium concentration, so the sodium relative to the water, will start to rise. That's a normal response to dehydration. And that's important because it signals a whole bunch of things in the body. It signals to our brain our sense of thirst to get water because we're dehydrated. It signals to our kidneys to conserve water so we pee less.
And then is that why the decision whether or not to supplement sodium has more to do with fluid consumed, like percent replacement, than it does with how much is lost?
Yeah, correct. So and then the opposite will happen if you just drink a whole lot of plain water. It'll dilute, obviously, the sodium in the blood, and the reverse will happen. You'll pee out more and you'll feel less thirsty and less need to drink water. So that's a normal physiological response. So if you go out and do your 1 hour run in summertime for you guys at the moment, if it's fairly warm where you live, you'll start sweating. You're probably not going to be replacing a huge amount of fluid during that 1 hour run because you don't really need to. Unless you're sweating liters an hour, your requirement for fluid in 1 hour, you're just not going to lose that much in that period of time. And so if you're not replacing that much fluid, what's happening? Well, your blood sodium is rising. It's going to make you more thirsty. So you're thirstier at the end of the run than you were at the start. Normal response. But your blood sodium concentration at the end of that run is going to be higher than it was at the start of that run. Now, this is the difference between the blood sodium concentration versus the total amount of sodium in the body. And that gets to your point then, Alex, of, are we working out sodium requirements based on simply how much you lose, or is it how much you lose plus how much water you replace? And again, that comes back to, do we care about the total amount of sodium in the body, or do we care about the balance between the sodium and the fluid in the body? So if we care about the total amount of sodium in the body, yes, we just do that based on losses, but we've got evidence now that doesn't really make a difference, even in fairly large losses. If we think about the concentration, again, in a 1 or 2 hour run, anything up to probably 4 hours, to be honest, it's probably not, unless you're completely inappropriately over-consuming fluid, it's not going to be enough to really push that blood sodium up or down too dramatically either way. And so you don't really need to worry about electrolytes in either of those situations. And My recommendation generally is if the exercise is less than 4 hours duration, there's not really any kind of real world scenario that I can think of where replacing a specific amount of sodium, like going out and testing it and going, this is my requirement, and then taking that, is actually going to add value based on the evidence that we have at this stage. Once you get beyond that into ultra marathons, different story. But in those shorter events, no.
So how much, I mean, the other kind of craze these days is, the Gatorade sweat patch and personalize your strategy, yada, yada, yada. How much should people like pursue that versus just following general guidelines with a lot of these different things?
So yeah, the Gatorade patch is an interesting one. Users outside the US may not be aware that that's only sold in the US. You can't get it outside of America.
We do tend to think that whatever happens here is the most important thing ever. So that's fair.
You got a large population.
I'm curious why it's only in America now.
I'm not sure. I think it's always been the case.
Okay.
For the patch. I mean, obviously all the other Gatorade products you can buy internationally.
Yeah, interesting.
But there's a bunch of, wearable, like hardware wearable devices now that are reusable as well that are coming onto the market. So listeners might be aware if there's like Nix and H-Drop, both American companies. There's Flow Bio, which is a UK company, and they're in sort of various stages of sort of validating the accuracy of those. So I think we're still away from saying, yes, they're definitely accurate and a good substitute from going to a lab and having patches put on properly and that kind of thing. But to your point, Drew, is that actually adding value to the person in terms of working out your sodium requirements? Well, you can do all of this, and there's been a lot of work over the years of refining these assessment techniques of measuring and perfecting the quantification of sodium loss. But there's been almost nothing in the research of saying, okay, you've got this number now, what do I do with it? So, you even if you do like the gold standard sort of lab patch testing method, you get your number and you're losing so many milligrams an hour of sodium. What does that number actually mean, and what do you replace? And there's literally nothing in the literature. And so I think a lot of companies have kind of made up their own values, and you can kind of have a go at them and say, oh, that's terrible. They're just, deceiving people and making up values that are nonsense to sell product and things. But to be fair to those companies, they're being asked that question by a lot of people and they don't have an answer, and there's no research to give them an answer. So they have to come up with something because there's a real vacuum. And so for me, I mean, that's probably the work I've done over the last 10 years is trying to get towards some answer to that question. And the first question is, well, is knowing that value actually going to change what you do in a way that's beneficial or value add? And for me, the only time that sweat sodium testing is adding value is in that sort of ultra distance exercise. You're talking, probably 8-10 hours plus of continuous exercise where you're losing a lot of water and a lot of sodium and replacing a fair chunk of that water. Then you need to start replacing a fair chunk of sodium to balance that fair chunk of water that you're replacing to maintain that blood sodium concentration. But shorter exercise, there's really no evidence that replacing a specific amount is going to be helpful. And so the way I kind of frame it is, for that longer stuff, then sweat testing might be valuable. You don't have to replace 100% of what you lose, even in those circumstances. But for shorter duration, sort of less than 4 hours of continuous exercise, the message that I use is kind of season to taste. It's choose your sodium products based on what tastes good to you, what's going to help you, encourage you to consume an appropriate amount of fluid that's not over or under, and what's going to encourage you to fuel well from a carbohydrate perspective if that's relevant to what you're doing.
There's like a recurring theme when we have like folks like you come on who have spent a lot of time in a specific area and have come to some really like objective conclusions on what actually works, despite what marketing says, and whether that's hydration or nutrition. The theme seems to be only when you're at the very highest levels of performance do these interventions really make a difference. However, General Pop loves to spend a ton of money buying things that they think matter as opposed to just like moving their body.
It's also just the nature of business. Like the companies saturate the market where the thing actually matters, and then they have to keep growing somewhere. So they figure out how to sell it to everybody else.
I guess for you, Alan, my question, like, do you just like bang your head against the wall? Because I go to the grocery store now. I don't know how it is in Australia. In the United States, there are entire aisles dedicated to like electrolyte supplements now. It's out of control.
Yeah, here it's more online. There is a little bit of that, but a lot of it is online sales, and there's companies over here that have like subscription models. So you subscribe and you get your monthly electrolyte delivery kind of thing. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I think the irony though is that, you know, there is a small group in the population where it is actually really helpful. And if everyone else didn't consume these products, they would be such a niche product that they'd probably be 5 times the cost that they
That's
are
a good
now.
point. Yeah.
So
fair.
the fact that everyone else is buying them when they don't need them, it's kind of subsidizing it for the people that do, because it's creating the economy of scale that allows that product to be at a reasonable price. But yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think I don't bang my head against the table too much in that for the majority of people, it's probably not harmful. It's just not necessarily beneficial.
That's fair.
I hadn't really considered, because there are like a couple kind of unique medical conditions where like elevated salt intake is kind of crucial to like maintain normalcy, and all of a sudden all that stuff is super available regardless of whether it's through medical
flavored
channels or not. Okay. This one is kind of to set like, because when I was looking through your work, I was trying to figure out like what the threshold is. Not looking at those medical conditions. We're back to just like people who are exercising and worried about electrolyte balance and fluid intake and stuff. And I want you to like tell me how on target I am of my like reading of your work, because it sounds like the threshold, to piece it together from a couple things, you're probably going to need like 5 liter total fluid loss. You're probably going to need to be replacing at least 70% of that. You're probably going to need to be experiencing like a 2% drop in body weight, and the event's probably going to need to be longer than 4 hours. Is that like a decent threshold where like this is the point at which it starts to be really important?
Yeah, the 2% thing, I'll clarify on that. It's really the 70% or more fluid replacement is necessary to prevent that more than 2% body mass loss, which is why it generally tends to be 4 hours plus of exercise, because below that, you don't actually need to replace that much fluid to stay within that 2%.
Okay. Is there like a heat threshold, or is that just, that drives the total loss?
Yeah, that just drives the total loss in terms of sweat rate. Yeah. Yep. There is a little bit of nuance in that around sweat sodium concentration. So people that lose more sodium in their sweat, that 70% might go down to sort of 60, 65%. People that have very low sodium sweat, that, you know, you could probably push that up to maybe 80% fluid replacement before you need to worry about that. But to be honest, I think the difference between supplementing a bit early or a bit late is so small that it's probably not worth getting into 60 to 80%
is still a pretty narrow window.
Yeah. Unless you're doing like, 30 hours of continuous exercise where that discrepancy might accumulate over a really long time. Yeah, it might be important there, but otherwise probably not.
Okay. So is it fair to say to the audience that if they never do cardio sessions longer than 4 continuous hours, they probably don't need to be that worried about supplemental electrolytes?
Certainly during exercise, correct.
Okay.
Yes. Before exercise, it may help retain fluid if you're drinking a big whack of fluid before exercise, just to try and get hydrated if you're not already. And similarly post-exercise. But again, if you're consuming, as we said earlier, solid food with that, it's probably not going to make a huge difference. But if you're drinking that fluid in isolation, then it can be helpful there. And as I said, flavor-wise, it can be helpful if it just encourages you to drink more if you're probably not drinking enough. But you don't need a sweat test to tell you what tastes good.
That's where I think we lose the plot a little bit in military settings, because the classic example of when people are doing like long duration exertion stuff is field training type of environments. But the rations we give them have like 1,600 to 2,300 milligrams of sodium if you eat the whole thing. Like you probably don't need to bring a stick of something else if you're consuming a ration that was like already engineered with that in mind. Yes, certain training events, you're not eating rations, you're eating regular food, but like we're coming from America, we tend to have too much sodium in the food anyway. So
Yeah, well, likewise over here. So yeah, you're right. The average person consumes too much, and that comes to the other question of just if I'm sweating a lot on a day-to-day basis because I train a lot, do I just have generally higher sodium requirements on a daily basis? And the answer is, well, one, you're probably consuming more sodium than you need in the first place, just through your normal diet, regardless of supplements and things. And two, your kidneys and your sweat glands to an extent are very adaptable to differences in sodium intake. So, if you go out and sweat a lot of sodium out, within a few days, your sweat becomes less salty, and your kidneys adjust within hours, your sweat glands within a day or two, but they will actually start to produce urine and sweat that is less salty in response to that drop in sodium intake or that increased sodium loss that hasn't been replaced. So, yeah, look, you wouldn't want to cut your sodium down to really low levels. But for the average person with the average diet, I don't think they need to necessarily add more because they're sweating more, your kidneys will take care of that pretty easily.
Again, that seems to be such a common trope. And what comes to mind when you start talking about kidneys is just like the cleansing diets and the juicing diets and all, it's like, I think your body pretty well handles that, but hey, go for it if it makes you feel better.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't have lasted this long as a species if they couldn't do these sort of basic functions of adjusting to highly variable intakes.
How did we survive on the savannah without sodium supplementation? I just don't, who knows?
Yeah, well, apparently water stopped working in about 2022, but
I had this thought earlier when you mentioned COVID and sort of the rise of the massive water bottle. That had to be around the same time when coconut water became like the hotness. Where does that fit in? And I say that because not too long ago I was at the it was like one of the U.S. men's national team. It's like their pre-World Cup game. I think they were playing Senegal. And we're leaving the stadium and there are tents giving out free either coconut water or the non-coconut water version of basically the same thing, free electrolyte supplementation. Anything to say about that? Coconut water.
Well, it has some sodium in it, naturally. So, people have used it as kind of quote unquote the natural form of electrolytes, but it's neither here nor there.
That's fair. You mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to ask it again for the folks that I know have this question. If so, now listening to this, I realize I'm the type of person that doesn't need to necessarily use supplementation. Are there negative side effects to doing it if I don't need to? I.e., this powder tastes really good. I'm going to throw out my water bottle anyway in the middle of the day because why not? Is that, I don't want to use the word dangerous, but hopefully it makes sense what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, it does. I think in relatively sensible doses, no, unless you have a medical condition where you've been advised to reduce your sodium. Obviously, that's a consideration. If you've got a strong family history of high blood pressure or heart disease or something like that, you might think twice about it. Otherwise, it's unlikely to be harmful unless you have really high doses, and that generally would happen more from like capsules and tablets rather than having it in a drink form, because usually if you get to that point, it'll just taste so horrible you won't want to drink much of it anyway. But yeah, you can get to that point in capsules and tablets, and you do see that from time to time in sort of ultra distance sporting events where people take electrolyte capsules and take too many, or take them and don't consume enough water with them. They can cause vomiting and pretty bad nausea. It was funny actually. I had to test the capsules that we used for my PhD research because as I said before, we did the blinding with the sodium and the placebo capsules. And I'd been warned from a colleague I used to work in a hospital with years prior to this, who'd done a study more looking at kidney function in people with diabetes, but they used capsules, and they said, oh, you got to be careful because you can get quite nauseous with the capsules if you take too many in one hit. So I thought, okay, well, I was experimenting in the kitchen at work and making up these capsules, and they were just gelatin capsules. So they basically dissolve as soon as they hit water. And I thought, oh, we'll see how many we can take and tolerate. So I think I had 5 or 6 capsules, whatever it was. 10 minutes later, I was vomiting. It wasn't pleasant. And I quickly learnt the lesson that 1, you have to spread them out. 2, you use the vegan capsules, the cellulose capsules, because they break down, dissolve more slowly and release it more slowly. And thirdly, try and have it with food and plenty of water. And that definitely helps.
One where it's not actually like the sodium that matters necessarily, but like consuming sodium can encourage more water intake is the encouraging water drinking version of how sodium can affect hydration, like a piece of the puzzle worth factoring in.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And it differs depending on whether it's at rest, so maybe before exercise versus during exercise. So before exercise,
or a bowl of chips at the restaurant.
In isolation, there definitely seems to be a beneficial effect there. I think in a lot of real world scenarios there, though, when you're running around and doing other things as you're preparing for whatever it is that you're doing, exercise or whatever, maybe the effect is going to be blunted a bit just from the fact that you're distracted, and drinking is ultimately a behavior. So you can kind of give it a physiological nudge by making your blood saltier. And that has to be very high. If you're having it in fluid form, it has to be pretty salty before that'll have an effect. You're not just talking your standard sports drink. You're talking, your kind of clinical rehydration type products, or just taking it with a beverage. You'll retain it a bit better. During exercise, the research is really mixed on this. So in some studies where they've used salt capsules, people end up drinking maybe 200 mils an hour more than the placebo capsules. In the 5-hour study I mentioned before, this was one of the things that we specifically looked at. The difference was tiny. It was only about 80 mils an hour, and it wasn't statistically significant. So it's a mixed bag in terms of the research on that. But I think, ultimately, as I said, drinking is a behavior. So we can try and give it a physiological nudge, but even just the taste of it, if it encourages you to drink more because you like the fluid that you've got in your hand, that can be potentially beneficial as well.
Before we let you go, I want to throw some rapid fire questions at you, and don't take that to mean these need to be rapid fire answers. I want you to go as deep as you need to, but what's like, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Like, with regards to everything that we've talked about, what's like a question everybody thinks has been answered that still just needs much better research than folks realize?
I think sodium and performance is a big one, like physical performance. I did a systematic review of this during my PhD. So this was, I think, 2018, I think I published it. And I could only find 5 studies that actually met our inclusion criteria that have looked at sodium performance. And you compare that to, say, something like caffeine, there'd be hundreds. Or carbohydrate or something like that. This was endurance performance specifically, but there's actually very, very little out there. And almost none of them, and that 5-hour study I mentioned before was published in 2023. And that was the first study ever to actually sweat test people and then give sodium in a study based on the amount that they lost, as opposed to just giving everyone an arbitrary amount. So that's kind of how sparse and how
5 studies.
How not disorganized, but how non-customized, I guess, for lack of a better word, the literature is in the area. Yeah.
Interesting. So like, if you could, and this is kind of a riff off of that one, but I know this is somewhat impossible to predict, but like, where do you think this body of literature sits 10 years from now? Like, what do you think we look back on and we're like, holy cow, what were we thinking?
I think there are a few gaps in the literature that still need to be filled. Some of these areas, as I said, have got some research, but very little research. So they could be beefed up quite significantly. There are other areas that we just have nothing. One of the ones of interest to me, I don't think it's necessarily going to show anything earth-shattering, but over the last 10 years or so, there's been a shift in products away from using sodium chloride as the source of sodium towards sodium citrate. Now, that is interesting to me because sodium and chloride are generally regulated together throughout the body. So what happens when you start to uncouple that in terms of what you're actually putting into the body? And so you're replacing potentially all of the sodium and none of the chloride. Look, I don't think you're going to find anything earth-shattering there because we're not seeing this epidemic of people in ultra marathons and stuff ending up in the medical tent since a lot of products changed from sodium chloride to sodium citrate. But it will be interesting to see if there is any sort of subtle differences there and how the body handles that, how the kidneys handle that post-exercise as well. So, yeah, there's that. There's a couple of other areas, like a lot of research, there's quite a lot in males and very little in females. And that's very common across sort of exercise and sports science. So, some more research specifically in female exercises or athletes would be helpful in this space as well. I think it's just beefing up what we have, but I don't think we're that far away actually from having a reasonably complete picture of the situation.
Interesting.
I realized that there was something we were supposed to circle back to, and I completely forgot about it. So I'm going to disrupt Drew's rapid fire questions we have been talking this whole time about sodium, brief mentions of sodium and chloride. We haven't really addressed potassium, magnesium, calcium. Like, are we leaving anything on the table by like using electrolytes and sodium interchangeably when we talk about exercise, or are we missing something there?
Yeah, great question. You're right. So in sweat, we lose sodium and chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium, probably others in much smaller amounts. But the reality is that sodium and chloride are by far the main ones that we lose. And that's because if we look at the composition, I mentioned before, that sort of interstitial fluid that the sweat glands use as the starting point to make sweat from, its interchanges with the blood. And if you look at the composition of blood, it's very high in sodium, 140-ish millimoles per liter, very high in chloride, around 120. And then you look at the other electrolytes that you just mentioned, potassium, it's usually around like 5. Calcium, magnesium are really low as well. And so you look at the composition of sweat when you actually collect it on the outside of the body. It's got a fair bit of sodium and chloride in it, but the potassium is again maybe 3 to 5 millimoles per liter, whereas in sodium it could be anywhere between 20 and 80. That's depending on what the sweat glands are doing. And then calcium, magnesium, you're talking like maybe 1 millimole per liter. It's really tiny. So, not that those things don't have important functions in the body, but we just don't lose that much of them. And they're very easy to replace through normal food. There's even less literature on those in this context as well, because sodium is the main one that we lose in sweat. It's the one that's had the most focus in research. So if you went to the literature and tried to find, show me the studies around potassium and all this other stuff that we talked about today, or magnesium or calcium, you'd be pretty disappointed.
Fair enough.
Okay, last question for you, and it's a two-parter. And Alex, I don't think we've asked this one for a while.
It's been a few weeks.
It's been a while, but I'm very curious how you'll take this. So I want something that you have doubled down on and something that you have changed your mind on.
Double down on, I would think, is the fluid stuff that we were talking about before. The fact that, that 2% isn't really a fixed number. It's not like you get to 2.1% and performance falls off a cliff and 1.9 and you're fine. That's something I've definitely doubled down on over the years. And I think the literature is starting to sort of show more around that. The one I've sort of changed my mind on is actually probably the sodium, to be honest. If you read Tim Noakes' book and the sort of stuff that he talks about, and some of his colleagues, back in the 2010s, a lot of it was just that sodium was completely unnecessary in any circumstances. When I used to do nutrition plans, when I'd be working with athletes, I'd work out the carbs and the fluid and maybe caffeine if it was relevant, and I'd pretty much just ignore the sodium. Whereas now, I still would for those shorter events that we talked about, the sort of less than 4 hours, your marathons, your Olympic distance triathlons, all that kind of stuff. But for, I do a lot of work with ultra runners, ultra trail runners and things. That's a group where, yes, I would actually start to pay more attention to that maybe than I used to. And not that it's going out there and smashing bucket loads of salt capsules, but it's about understanding what your expected losses are, what your expected fluid needs are, and then trying to get the sodium to kind of help balance out that fluid replacement.
Interesting. Beautiful.
I like
So
it.
for the rest of us out there not running for multiple hours, don't worry about it.
Yep,
Beautiful.
have sodium if you like the taste, but otherwise don't. And don't get obsessed with trying to quantify it and target a specific amount, because it's probably not going to make any difference.
All right.
See-
The one I'm walking away with is if you don't know your percent fluid replacement, you're probably not at a place yet where electrolyte supplementation matters.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for a lot of athletes, even in the ultra space, they wouldn't know that number because it's not the way that it's been traditionally framed.
Mm.
You know, I kind of got that number when I was doing some modeling data and trying to figure out the best way to present it in a paper. And I'd sort of looked at just the traditional way we might have approached it. And it wasn't until I did the percentage that I could come up with this nice, it's still not simple, but simpler way to explain it, was using those percentage numbers. But traditionally, it's probably not a number that we've tended to talk about or focus on.
I like the story around that research. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you ended up doing that because COVID happened and you couldn't do the traditional lab work that you wanted to do. So you switched to modeling stuff that you could do without lab subjects.
Yeah, that's right. So we started a study in 2019. This is the 5-hour one I was talking about before. So we got a grant from the Ultra Sport Science Foundation to do that. And we started that in 2019. And then obviously COVID hit, so we had to stop. And there was a research conference happening in 2021, and I wanted to present something, and I didn't have anything ready to present. So I thought, I'll take this. I was aware of this modeling equation that actually comes from the clinical, like the hospital medical world in terms of intravenous rehydration. But it has been validated in exercise before. So I thought, the way it's been validated is try to predict your blood sodium changes going up and down and by how much, depending on all your inputs and outputs. But, it's an equation, so you can just, use algebra and rearrange it. And I thought, I can rearrange it to work out what is actually the sodium need to maintain a stable blood sodium given the other inputs and outputs. So I did that and presented that at a conference in 2021. And I never really thought more about it. It was just like, I'll just put in an abstract for the conference, something to do during COVID. And then I started getting text messages from people going, "Oh, is this published, or when's it going to be published?" So I thought, well, I better write it up now and publish it, because it wasn't the original aim. But it's certainly become a study that has been, a lot of people have found really useful, and I refer back to all the time. So I'm glad I did. Yeah.
Boom.
That's awesome.
Well, that's why we had you on, to clear all this up for us. So thank you.
All right. No problem at all.
Enjoy your Friday, sir.
Will do. Go to Socceroos.
Good luck. Team, welcome to the after party. That episode made me thirsty, if I'm being honest with you.
That episode had the same effect on you as sodium does? That's interesting.
I was thinking, so it's interesting. I like when we talk to researchers, because it always makes me happy, I guess, that while 99.9% of us are just bumblefucking our way through, like, working out, and there's a protein shake, and I like drip drop and whatever, get more sleep. There's guys like Alan who are legit in the weeds, like figuring out the right answer.
Part of me wonders how all that has affected his own nutritional habits. Like,
yeah, that's a good point.
Do you think he even cares about it for himself, or do you think it's only for the ultra marathoners that he supports?
It's like, and I don't know if this is the right comp, but it's like when you drive past the hospital and there's doctors outside smoking. It's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
No, I can imagine Alan's nutrition or hydration, approach to hydration is pretty sound.
Sure.
I think though, team, look, the big takeaway, which seems to be the big takeaway every time we have these conversations, just don't worry about it. Like, you're not there. You're not there. And I'm including myself in that. I love the taste of these things, but I should probably be doing more Crystal Light and less drip drop. I keep picking on drip drop. There's other options out there.
You've been hating on me lately for doing too much cardio, and I don't even do enough cardio for this to matter.
Well, that's my point. No one listening to that. Well, I don't know. We might have some people listening to this that are going 5, 6, 7 hours, but you're not him or her. And that's the same for hydration. That's the same for nutrition. That's the same for basically any intervention you could think of that isn't just like basic movement and occasionally lift weights and run sometimes and get a ton of sleep and make friends.
Have you looked at the like protein versus exercise stuff for muscle protein synthesis?
Not in a long time.
And that's like an episode we could potentially do later, but everybody is like worried about how much protein they're getting. The relative difference in impact between like protein consumption versus resistance training, it's all resistance training.
For
like,
sure.
The protein consumption is like the icing on the cake. The resistance training is the thing.
The more we've been doing this, I think people just want icing.
I mean, yeah, people like to major in the minors.
They just want the sprinkles. They don't care about the rest of the cake. I'd be curious if there were a way to like, somebody like Alan, who's obviously very refined when it comes to creating research. I'd be so curious if you set some sort of baseline, like, okay, here's the baseline level of knowledge when it comes to like understanding electrolyte supplementation. The time it takes an average person to get to that, if they were to have instead just walked on a treadmill, which would have a better impact on their health? The sodium/electrolyte supplement or just walking on a treadmill for the same amount of time? I think the answer is probably just walk on a treadmill.
I got to say, something I appreciate deeply that showed up throughout the episode with Alan is that not only is he able to like off the cuff point to a specific study when he's going to say something, but he's also deeply familiar with the methodology of every study he references, not just the conclusions. And it started from the top. He mentioned that beverage hydration index study. I have looked at that bar graph uncritically a million times. Like oral rehydration is first, like the electrolyte stuff, then like skim milk and whole milk, then like basically everything else. And I never thought twice about like looking up what they used as their definition of hydration.
And there's the problem.
And like hadn't even considered gastric emptying as part of it. Like, but he like knew exactly what the methodology was and whether or not it was like a true test of the thing. That I love that.
Which is funny because it took him 2 seconds to explain that. And as soon as he did, you're like, oh, wait, that's that.
Like, there goes years of a thing I cared about. I was thinking about doing a post with that bar graph on the Instagram because we're talking about hydration. Like, well,
not anymore. Yeah. That is a unique and underappreciated talent to just be able to rip methods from studies off the cuff. I also don't think I'm ever going to get over the way you say milk.
Sorry.
Milk. Say milk.
It's a regional thing. Now that you've talked about it,
say milk.
I'm like very aware. Like milk. I get it.
Milk. You say milk.
I understand.
Milk? There's another word. Sorry, I think is another one that you say weird.
I say sorry. I say it pretty normal.
What's the other word you say that's weird?
I don't know. Because I grew up in Chicago. I wasn't far enough north to get any like the Minnesota, Wisconsin stuff. But
milk. I say naked. And oil.
You know the whole Minnesota, Wisconsin thing, like the flag and bag and
no. Yeah, I've never been to either one of those places.
Sorry about that,
man.
Anyway. Or met a person who's from those places.
Yeah. You. Team, you don't need it. Basically, just keep doing what you're doing. Exercise hard. When you get to multiple hours, guys like Alan have your back.
And if you have high blood pressure, actively avoid it.
Yeah, which that's probably a whole different conversation. Team, thanks for hanging out, and we will see you well hydrated next week.
This week's episode is brought to you by Teamworks. If you have performance data scattered across apps, spreadsheets, group chats, it means things get missed. Teamworks brings it all together. Training, nutrition, scheduling, communication, all in one platform built for the people responsible for readiness. Learn more today at teamworkstactical.com.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.